right, so today I want to talk a little bit more about that 7 days where we're going to be manifesting our new life before we are actually caught up to God and to his throne as his children, his raptured people. Now, I've done a lot of videos comparing the symbolism of a bride as far as the rapture goes and the symbolism of a son. Revelation uses the symbolism of a son, okay, not a bride. So when we are looking at Revelation chapter 12, and I believe that the great sign that occurred on September 23rd of 2017 was our heads up that things were starting. That actually placed us in the book of Revelation, not necessarily in the tribulation, but in the book of Revelation. And that the next thing we're looking for is the sign of the dragon. And there's going to be a period of time between the great sign and when the sign of the dragon takes place. I know a lot of people in 2017, myself included, were hoping that the great sign of the dragon, which included the child being caught up or harpazoed to God, would happen at the same time. We didn't realize we're looking at two different signs that are going to have a separation in time. We don't know how long, but we do know that it'll start with the woman going into travail. The travail of the woman is Israel. This means a war, okay? And I'm thinking of the Gog-Magog invasion of Israel. That's the invasion that God actually controls. When that happens, he puts the hook into the jaw of the leader of that alliance and brings him down to the mountains of Israel. Not to Jerusalem, but to the mountains of Israel, the Golan Heights. Once that war starts, that's our indication that when that war is over, we're going to be transformed in some way. Okay, we'll talk more about that later on. Just like labor sort of ceases once the child is born, once the war is over, that's when we're going to be identified. So this war will take place for a period of time. We don't know how long. I think the war may actually even start on Yom Kippur, and I'm still leaning toward fall feasts for all of this stuff. There's reasons for it, okay? We don't know how long the war will last, but we know that when it's over, we'll be here, okay? The child is going to be born. Now, when I very first started reading Revelation, I came to Revelation 12 when I first started doing my in-depth studies, and I realized that the child being born and the child being caught up were like two different things. They're not the same thing. The child is born. That means we know it's a little boy, you know, congratulations, it's a son. And being caught up is something different. It's not like as soon as the child is born, it's immediately caught up, or that the birth of the child and the catching away of the child's the same thing. They're not the same thing. And that was like a new thought for me at the time. And I'm thinking, oh, okay, you know, at that time I was kind of more or less leaning to feast days for every single thing along the way. And I thought that perhaps the birth of the child would be on the Feast of Trumpets, and then the rapture would take place on the Day of Atonement. Okay, so I had 10 days between when I thought the child would be born on the Feast of Trumpets and caught up on the Day of Atonement when priests go into the holy place. Okay, so that was that was a good start, okay, in actually identifying that the birth and the catching away are two different things. Now, when you're using the illustration of a son or a baby boy being born, there shouldn't be any confusion about how much time there is between when the child is born and when the baby is presented to God. That's always 7 days with the 8th day circumcision and naming. So between the time when the child is born and when the child is caught up, there's going to be a total of 8 days. Okay? 7 days with an 8th day. Okay? 7 and 1. 7 days with this 8th day, and the 8th day is the important day. I know we make a big deal about birthdays, and so we talk about the birthday of the church and all of that sort of thing. But you know, if you're a Jewish person, a birthday is not like the big day, especially if you have a son. The big day is right here on the 8th day, okay? And this time period, the 7 days before that, is sort of limbo land. We know we have a little boy, but he's not yet been brought into the community, circumcised, and so on. So what we're looking at here is a 7-day with an 8th day pattern. Okay, that's the pattern for the Son. That's why I use this pattern for the rapture, because it's in the book of Revelation, which is the end time guideline for how we're supposed to be thinking about the end times if you're a believer. All right, Revelation is our guidebook. Revelation is the place that we go to find out how things are going to play out. So when we look at the rapture, when Revelation talks about it, it's not talking about a bride. It's talking about a child who is born. Of course, Christ was the male child, the one who's to rule all nations with the rod of iron, but we are also male children who are going to rule with a rod of iron. Those of us who are firstborn, those who qualify, those who are faithful. When God is in something, he makes things bigger. Sometimes what he'll do is he'll make the entrance to something is very, very narrow. Okay, and it often will feel like our life is closing in on us. But on the other side is this very big, spacious place. Okay, so we have to go through this rather narrow vestibule, but once we go through it, on the other side, there is this it's huge. There's this panoramic view. Okay, this is how Scripture works. This is one of the ways you know you're on the right track when you're following the heart of God in something, because you're going to go through this narrow passageway, and then on the other side is this huge really, it's just this huge vista. He wants to lead us to these very broad places, but we have to go through the narrow place first. Okay, so what God has done in Revelation chapter 12, okay, with this birth of the child, and then the child being caught up to God into his throne, and then seeing the 24 elders who are in the throne room of God, kings and priests, and Christ has died to make us a kingdom of priests. That's us, the 24 elders in the throne room. We are also the child who will be caught up to God and to his throne. We're using the symbolism of a male child. The male child symbolism is the door we're going to go through here. We're going to go through that door, and then we're going to see what is on the other side of that. Well, there's so much that happens on the other side that I can't even talk about it all. And that's how I know God is in something. When it's so big, so broad, so expansive, there's so much that it's like a fire hose coming at you. Okay, so once I started looking at 7-day with an 8th day pattern, okay, now I start asking questions. Okay, I'm going to go through the doorway of the male child. I am not going to use the illustration of the bride, because that is not here. That's not here in the context of our rapture. The narrow door that God wants us to go through is the male child. So if you don't want to go through that doorway, you're going to end up going round and round with the same information, and you're never going to have anything new. Very little new is going to come into that system. And God has a whole Bible here, a whole Bible of patterns and illustrations that he wants to bring into this right here. And you have to go through the doorway that he has established. And here it's the idea of a baby boy being born. That gives us a 7-day with an 8th day pattern. So now I start asking questions, okay, because I'm on a hunt now. Are there any other 7 days with an 8th day patterns in the Bible? Yes, there are. One of them is the Feast of Tabernacles. And this is the joyous feast. This is the one that's full of joy. Just like having a child is full of joy. You know, when the labor's there, you're in sorrow, but when the child is born, you rejoice and you forget the pain. Okay? There's 7 days of living in a temporary dwelling place, and then on the 8th day, people have a solemn assembly. This is with the Feast of Tabernacles, and then go to their permanent homes. They are rejoicing, though, during that Feast of Tabernacles, even though they're living in these temporary dwellings, these little tents, these, with the leafy boughs over them, the palm branches, and so on. But this is a time of joy. So the Feast of Tabernacles is a 7-day with an 8th day convocation. That's part of a pattern here. Okay, and that, I believe, is a very good pattern for this child being born. I also believe Jesus was born over the Feast of Tabernacles, born on this day, circumcised on the 8th day. Now, is there any other 7-day with an 8th day? The answer is yes. Actually, it's about how a leper is cleansed. Okay, during the whole ritual of the cleansing of a leper, we're going to find 7 days with an 8th day. Are there any other illustrations? Yes, the ordination of Aaron. When Aaron became a priest, there was 7 days where he was in view of the people while he was being ordained. And then on the 8th day, he was actually able to go into the temple and begin his priestly ministry. These are patterns that if we look at them, they all apply to us. They all apply to us. This is just like marvelous and exciting. So now when we start digging into these things, we find out more about God and about his relationship with us, and we get more details, and we learn more even about the timing of the rapture. Okay, this is like so exciting, and I just wish people would take the opportunity of walking through this doorway of the male child and, just sort of leaving behind the bride stuff for a little bit, just long enough to like peek through that door and see what's out there. So I want to talk a bit today about the leper. Okay, it doesn't sound very exciting, but it is exciting. And what we're doing here is we're doing a very Jewish or Hebraic thing, and that is we are layering symbols over one another. So the symbols that we're layering here is the symbol or the pattern of the 7-day with that 8th day. That's the pattern that's being layered here. And all of these layers are going to fit into this place right here on our timeline for our rapture. All of these are going to be layered in. And actually, there are some more symbols that once we start going through, like the door of the leper, we're going to find a whole bunch more symbols and illustrations and learn different things about spiritual reality. So things get bigger. And this is why it's really hard for me to like I said earlier, it's like a fire hose coming at you. Once you see all the things that are there, how they can apply, it's God wants our lives to be bigger, and he wants us to have a full and complete as possible understanding of the plan of salvation, his relationship with us, how the end times are going to work out, so we actually can know some of the details about this stuff, so we're not in the dark. And remember, God has said that he shows people, he communicates with his prophets. I'm not saying I'm a prophet, but he's communicated through his prophets his secrets so that we're not taken by surprise. Leprosy is the only illness in the Bible that has a cleansing that when you're cleansed of it, you actually have to go to the priest, because it's a illness, it's a sickness that is a picture of sin. It's the only disease that represents our sin nature. Why do I say that? Well, let's look back to the first mention, and remember that's a principle of Bible interpretation, especially when we're looking at prophetic things or things that have some kind of symbolic layering there. We look back to the first mention, and that's the seed of the full-grown plant. Okay, that's where we actually see the beginning of an idea or a thought in Scripture. So leprosy is first mentioned in the book of Exodus, chapter 4, and it's in the context of something else. But both of these things that we're going to look at have to do with the nature of evil in the world. One represents Satan and the other represents our sinful human heart. So the background for the story is that God is calling Moses to go and deliver the Israelites from Pharaoh. Then Moses answered, "Behold, they will not believe me or listen to my voice. They'll say that the Lord did not appear to you." And the Lord said to him, "What's that in your hand?" And he said, "A staff." And he said, "Throw it on the ground." So he threw it on the ground, and it became a serpent, and Moses ran from it. But the Lord said to Moses, Put out your hand and catch it by the tail." So he put out his hand and caught it, and it became a staff in his hand. Verse 6, and again the Lord said to him, "Put your hand inside your cloak." And he put his hand inside his cloak, and when he took it out, behold, it was leprous, like snow. Then God said, "Put your hand back in your cloak." So he put his hand back in the cloak, and when he took it out, behold, it was restored like the rest of his flesh. Okay, so the staff in the Bible is a symbol of authority. God's authority has been usurped by the serpent. So when the staff became a serpent on the ground, it represented Satan. When Moses took the serpent by the tail and it became a staff again, God was demonstrating to Moses that God was going to be using him to have authority over Satan so that God's people could be set free. And Christ was going to have authority over the serpent too, so that we could be set free. Catching the serpent by the tail and having it turned back into a rod in Moses' hand ultimately represents how Christ came to take authority over Satan and set people free. Okay, so that's the little story there. Now, leprosy is a picture of sin, and especially the sin of pride. And we're going to talk more about this in a minute when we talk about Miriam and Naaman. The hand represents our actions. By placing his hand in his bosom, okay, inside of his jacket, near his heart, the sin that was in Moses' heart would then manifest on his hand and show up as leprosy. Jesus came to cleanse us from our leprous, sinful hearts, as well as the deeds that come from our sinful hearts. And he came to deliver us from the power of the serpent. Okay, so we know there's a group of people that has a secret sign where they put their hand in their jacket. And I believe that kind of goes back to this, to the leprous hand, the sinful hand, the hidden hand that is leprous. And you wouldn't know about the leprosy in the heart unless you saw the hand pulled out and the actions are sinful. The other thing that may have been happening here too is that God may have been giving Moses sort of a veiled warning against pride. And we're going to see what pride looks like with its relationship to leprosy here with Miriam. The story about Miriam is in Numbers 12. So Miriam and Aaron were like upset with Moses. Okay, and they're all brother and sisters, right? Because of this Cushite woman that Moses had married. And somehow or another, they connected that with, God speaking through them. And, I don't know exactly why that was. But has the Lord indeed spoken only through Moses? Has he not spoken through us also? So, God did speak through Aaron. God did speak through Miriam. And the Lord heard it. Okay. And he said, "Hear my words. If there is a prophet among you, I, the Lord, make myself known to him in a vision. I speak with him in a dream. But not so with my servant Moses. He is faithful in all my house." And of course, this is repeated in the book of Hebrews, where it talks about how Moses was faithful in all God's house as a servant, but Christ was faithful in God's house as a son. Okay, with him I speak mouth to mouth clearly and not in riddles, and he beholds the form of the Lord. Why then were you not afraid to speak against my servant Moses? And the anger of the Lord was kindled against them, and he departed. And as the cloud lifted from above the tent, suddenly Miriam became leprous, white as snow. And Aaron turned toward her and saw that she was leprous, and said to Moses, "My Lord, please do not hold against us this sin we have so foolishly committed. Please do not let her be like a stillborn infant whose flesh is half consumed when he comes out of his mother's womb." So Moses cried out to the Lord, "O God, please heal her." But the Lord answered Moses, if her father had but spit in her face, would she not have been in disgrace 7 days? Let her be confined outside the camp for 7 days, and after that she may be brought back in. So Miriam was confined outside the camp for 7 days, and the people did not move on until she was brought in again. And after that the people set out from Hazeroth and camped in the wilderness of Paran. Okay, so Miriam, she had an issue here with comparison. I don't know whether she was comparing herself with just Moses or Moses and the Cushite woman. I don't know what all that deal was there. But she was saying, look, God speaks through me too. It's not just you, Moses. And God was not happy with that. Miriam was stepping outside of the boundaries that God had placed. God spoke with Miriam. That was true. He spoke with her in dreams and visions and so on. But he said with Moses, I speak with him face to face. You should have been really afraid to criticize him because we're like best friends. Okay, we're like Moses and me, we're close. But we have this 7 days, okay, that Miriam was outside the camp. And then on the 8th day, she was brought in again to have basically fellowship with everybody else who were inside the camp. But by being offended by God's choice of Moses instead of herself, Miriam opened herself up to being overtaken by pride, which was the original sin of the serpent. She criticized Moses indirectly by complaining about his choice of a wife, and then she basically wanted to elevate herself to the same position as Moses, and she made more of her gift of prophecy than was warranted. So her timeout was what happened to her. She was given timeout because of her sin. And it was a very public display of shaming, and this must have been excruciating for Miriam, very humbling and a very embarrassing experience for her, but I am confident that it did its perfect work in her life. But it's a pattern, okay? It's a pattern of leprosy, okay? Leprosy is the only sickness that is representative of sin, and in particular, pride. The next illustration that I want to use from the Old Testament is a guy named Naaman, who was a Syrian. He wasn't an Israelite. His story is found in 2 Kings chapter 5, verses 10 through 14. So this is during the time of Elisha. This guy, the Syrian commander, he got leprosy, and he had a little captive Israelite girl who said, well, if you go down to Israel and meet with Elisha, he can heal you of your leprosy. So Naaman was all over that, and he went down and went to where Elisha was and asked him if he would help him. And Elisha sent his servant, a messenger, who said, go and wash yourself 7 times in the Jordan, and your flesh will be restored and you'll be clean. Okay, simple, just a little message, just go do this. But Naaman went away angry, saying, I thought he would surely come out, stand, and call on the name of the Lord his God, and wave his hand over the spot to cure my leprosy. Okay, see, this is, I'm going to interject something here. This is how people seem to think about, like the 2 witnesses, for example, that they're going to come out and do all this stuff, and everybody's going to see it, and it's, going to be big, and you know what? That isn't really how a lot of this stuff works, okay? It really isn't. But that's what Naaman thought. He thought that Elisha would come out and do this big display because that's what the false prophets and false priests do, okay, of other, I'm sure his foreign deity, that those priests would come out and wave their hands and do this big display. So he was mad. And then he criticized, like the Jordan. He said, are not the Abana and Pharpar, the rivers of Damascus, better than all the waters of Israel? Could I not have washed in them and been cleansed? So he turned and went away in a rage. Naaman's servants, however, approached him and said, my father, if the prophet had told you to do some great thing, would you not have done it? How much more then when he tells you, wash and be cleansed? So Naaman, got to hand it to this guy. He had a heart that he was willing to listen. So Naaman went down and dipped himself in the Jordan 7 times, according to the word of the man of God, and his flesh was restored and became like that of a little child, and he was clean. Okay. Many years later, John the Baptist would come along, dipping people, baptizing them in the Jordan. And by the way, the name Jordan means descent. People would be baptized as an outward symbol of repentance and their desire to live a new and holy life. Jesus also was baptized in the Jordan, but not because he was a sinner. He came to identify himself with us. Baptism is a picture of dying to self and being raised as a new person. So when Jesus was baptized, he died to his self. He died to himself. He came back as the last Adam, as one of us. And at that moment, God recognized Jesus as the last Adam. This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. But let's go back to Naaman here. For Naaman, the clean and beautiful rivers of Damascus, his country, the country he was so, proud of, represented the pride of life. So for Naaman to dip in the Jordan, a kind of a dirty, mucky little river, would have been to basically humble himself. It was humiliating. Why would he do that? He could go home and wash in a clean river. Why would he go down to this podunk river? So in order to do that, he had to actually humble himself and go and dip in the Jordan. Just do the simple thing that was asked of him. Go dip 7 times in the Jordan. So leprosy represents, it's not just sin in general, but the sin of pride and self-importance and self-aggrandizement. And just like Miriam wanted to be recognized as a really great spiritual person, the equal of her brother Moses, and for her own good, she had to be brought down a notch. God desired too that Naaman recognize that God opposes the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. And that's in James 4. Verse 6, he gives more grace. Therefore it says, God opposes the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. So there's another Old Testament illustration of someone with leprosy. And this is a king, Uzziah, who for most of his life was a really great guy and very talented and built marvelous structures, aqueducts and buildings and so on. He was a really great sort of a Renaissance guy in the Bible. But he decided that he wanted to do more. He wanted to actually be, take on the role or position of the priest. So 2 Chronicles 26, verses 16 through 20. When Uzziah grew powerful, his arrogance led to his own destruction. He was unfaithful to the Lord his God, for he entered the temple of God to burn incense on the altar of incense. Then Azariah the priest, along with 80 brave priests of the Lord, went in after him. And they took their stand against King Uzziah and said, Uzziah, you have no right to offer incense to the Lord. Only the priests, the descendants of Aaron, are consecrated to burn incense. Leave the sanctuary, for you have acted unfaithfully. You will not receive honor from the Lord God. Uzziah, with a censer in his hand to offer incense, was enraged. But while he raged against the priests in their presence in the house of the Lord before the altar of incense, leprosy broke out on his forehead. And when Azariah the chief priest and all the priests turned to him and saw his leprous forehead, they rushed him out. Indeed, he himself hurried to get out because the Lord had afflicted him. Okay, so Uzziah is an example of an accomplished and great man, a king who excelled in ruling over his people. But he was someone who refused the limits that God had placed on him. And really, God has placed limits and boundaries in all of our lives. He thought that God's boundaries did not apply to him. And even though it was forbidden for anyone but priests to offer incense in the temple, Uzziah chose to offer incense anyway. He chose to usurp the priest's role, and he went into the temple and he burnt the incense. And when he was confronted by these 80 priests in the temple about his bad behavior, he became enraged and leprosy broke out on his forehead. The heart, okay, is the symbol for one's affections, okay? And the leprosy is transferred from the heart to the hand with Moses. And okay, so the heart is the symbol of affections. The hand is the symbol of your actions and the things you do. And of course, if you have a leprous or sinful heart, your actions are going to be sinful too. In this case, it was on his forehead. And his forehead is the symbol for one's thoughts and reasonings and self-justification and pride. And I hope you noticed from a couple of these examples that when God confronts someone about pride and all of a sudden they get angry, okay, anger is sort of a byproduct of human pride. People who are humble do not get angry as often. Okay, they don't. They have nothing to defend. Part of the process of a leper being cleansed involved shaving his head and body before entering the camp. And in the handout here, the show notes, I actually have all of the passages that deal with the whole process of how a leper becomes cleansed. But I just want to talk about shaving the head. For the leper, when he went back into the camp, before he did that, he shaved all the hair off of his body, washed his clothes, and then went into the camp. And then he was in the camp for 7 days. And then just prior to going into the temple on the 8th day, he would shave his head again. So totally shaven, no hair on his head. I don't think they had to shave everything. Okay, eyebrows, I think, beard, everything. So shaving one's head represents basically, becoming a new person again. Like babies don't have much hair. They don't, they're pretty bald. Having a shaved head is like becoming a baby again. It's also a way of identifying yourself as someone who is in the process of being cleansed. People could actually look and go, oh yeah, that the guy you see over there who doesn't have any hair or eyebrows or anything, yeah, that's the guy who's being cleansed of leprosy. That's the one right there. And then on the 8th day, all that hair goes away again, and there's he's able to go into the temple. There's another place in the Bible that talks about shaving heads. And remember, I said, once you open a door, all of a sudden you're opening doors to all kinds of things. And you get this fire hose effect. So when we talk about leprosy, we talk about it's a picture of sin, and it has to do with what's in our hearts. And it's in our actions and also in our thoughts, like leprosy on the forehead. And then we talk about, when we get into the process of being cleansed, which is the whole story of redemption, by the way, is in the cleansing of the leper. The whole story of redemption is in that process, from the time we're born again until the time we're raptured. That whole process of cleansing the leper is the symbolic representation of us, becoming born again and going to heaven in our rapture, being glorified, and so on. So we've opened up basically a fire hose here of information. But shaving one's head is part of another ritual that I think is a fascinating illustration. And I just want to touch on it just a little bit here. If an Israelite man went to war and he saw a beautiful woman from the country he was at war with, and he wanted to make her his wife, there would be a process whereby the woman would transition from her old life into her new life, from her old country, her old language, her old identity, customs, and so on, and transfer into a new life with this Israelite husband, and thus becoming a part of the covenant people of God. So Deuteronomy 21 talks about this process. When you go to war against your enemies and the Lord your God delivers them into your hand, then you shall take them captive. And if you see a beautiful woman among them and you desire her and want to take her as your wife, then you shall bring her into your house, and she must shave her head, trim her nails, and put aside the clothing of her captivity. So a captive woman must shave her hair before becoming the wife of an Israelite. 1 Corinthians 11:15 tells us that if a woman has long hair, it's her glory. Her hair is given to her for a covering. In this case, she is going to shave off her glory, her pride, her glory, and she's going to be entering into a new kind of relationship, a new identity. So as the bride of Christ, we've been chosen, we've been brought out from among the nations, among the heathen, and we've been espoused to Christ. Part of the process of becoming his wife is to lay aside the clothing of our captivity, laying aside our earthly glory, our reputation, putting off the garments of our old nature. It's also, changing our language. It's actually taking on a whole new identity. And the garments of our old nature are represented by the clothing of our captivity, which is our earthly nature. So spiritually speaking, what we're talking about is when there is a kind of a humbling and a humiliation when we are transferring from one life to another life. And there is a self-abasement that takes place with this. Baptism, okay, that dipping in the Jordan like the Naaman did. Circumcision, which is basically beginning a new life in the covenant community of Israel. And shaving one's head. All of these things are symbolic of laying aside an old life to begin a new life. When you're baptized, you lay aside your old life, you are born to a new life. When the captive woman shaves her head, she is being transferred from the life of captivity into a new life with her new husband in the community of God. When a baby is born, a male child is born, there's a 7-day period before he's brought into the full community of faith. The idea, these pictures here all are kind of similar. They're all they're similar pictures representing dying to an old life and coming back in a new life. So how does this relate to this 7-day with an 8th day at the end? One of the common denominators here is this transition. Okay, there is a time of transition for all of these things. Whether it's dipping in the Jordan 7 times, okay, or you're Miriam and you're, outside the camp for seven days, whether it's a child who is born and identified as a male child but has to wait 7 days to be circumcised and actually given a name. This is a little nameless baby over here. Okay, it's not until the 8th day that he gets his name. The priests, when they were ordained, they got their beautiful clothes on and all of that, but they were 7 days outside or in the doorway of the tabernacle before they could actually go in and minister on this day right here, the 8th day. From walking through this door of the male child, symbolically speaking, there's going to be a time of transition before we're brought to heaven and presented to God and glorified. A time of transition, but we're identified. Just like the leper is identified as the person in transition because he's got a bald head. The woman is being identified as someone who is about to be made a full-fledged member of the life of Israel because she's walking around with a bald head, and cut nails and different clothes on. There is going to be some identifying mark that we are transitioning from being born to this 8th day when we're going to be presented to God. So this will be a time of transition, and like the captive woman who is going to have to, who uses this time, and actually I think for her it's 30 days, but she uses this time to basically mourn the loss of her old life. When we have an opportunity, here to let go of earthly things, to say farewell, to have an opportunity to even grieve over people we may be leaving behind. A lot of people have left behind letters and so on. I don't think you need to leave a left behind letter particularly. I think you're going to be able to say it. I think you'll be able to go to people and actually communicate with them what's happening. This will also be a time of for self-examination with regard to our place in the body of Christ, an opportunity to let go of pride and self-interest and self-promotion. Romans 12:4 says this, "For by the grace given to me, I say to everyone among you, not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think, but to think with sober judgment, each according to the measure of faith that God has assigned." And we can expect to have joyful anticipation of full participation in the community of faith, both at home in the New Jerusalem and with God in heaven. So this is also, in addition to a time of transition, this is a time of joy. Really, it's going to be a time of joy. And we can joyfully anticipate the putting on of our new clothing, our new bodies, our heavenly glorified bodies, which will be given to us on this day right here, the day of new beginnings, which is what the number 8 represents. And we can rejoice in our anticipation of a new life with a worthy husband. So thank you for walking through this little doorway with me and peeking out on all the things that are on the other side. And I just want to kind of reiterate this one little principle again, is that when you're following after the things of God, especially if you're wanting wisdom and you're wanting to understand, what's happening, if you're in a place where you're just going round and round, you're just going round and round and you're covering the same information over and over and over again, which is one of the things that I've noticed, especially about people who are dispensationalists, teach a pre-tribulation rapture, 7-year tribulations, rapture of the bride, 7-year wedding, supper of the Lamb in heaven, and then the second coming of Christ. Okay, that's this right here, going round and round and round in the same circle, talking about the days of Noah, Lot, all of that. It's covering the same information over and over again, but there's no more nourishment there. You've basically depleted any kind of substance that may have been there. And like shepherds with sheep, I don't know this for myself. I only know this because I read this somewhere a long time ago, that the reason sheep have shepherds is because sheep are not too bright. And one of the things they do is if they found a green pasture and some head sheep starts going round and round circles and they're eating the the goodness of the grass there, eventually they'll just keep eating in that circle even though all the grass is gone. And so the shepherd actually has to bump them out of their comfort zone and lead them to another place where there's green grass. So if you found that you're looking at the same information over and over again and there's really nothing much there that is like opening horizons and vistas for you, then you need to ask the question, have I overgrazed this? Is there another pasture somewhere where there's actually something that's really green and yummy to eat? My proposal to you is that if you are willing to go through this narrow door right here of the 7-8 day child baby boy illustration, there is so much more that's on the other side of that. And I don't think you'll be disappointed. Anyway, thank you for watching the video. I hope you'll subscribe if you haven't. I'm going to leave a link to my revelation in chronological order according to how I see the events happening. It's not probably 100% correct, but it's a pretty good guesstimation of the order of events as we see in the book of Revelation. So till the next video, I pray you'll have a very, very blessed day.